Hey there, Honors Biology. This is Mrs. Cozen, and these will be your notes for Unit 2. This is going to be Part 1 Chemistry Review. We will start by talking about the objectives that we will talk about in this unit and some of the key vocabulary that you're going to see. Okay, first, objectives for this unit. First is describe the composition of the 4 major organic molecules. You guys don't need to write these down. You can always come back to this video if you need to see them again. We are going to be talking about 4 major macromolecules, but we are going to review chemistry first before we learn about those. Second, explain the structure and function of those macromolecules. Those are going to be molecules that are in living things. Obviously, in biology, we're going to be working with living things. And then describe how dehydration and hydrolysis relate to those. Those are the different processes that are going to either break our molecules apart or build them up. And the next objective, recognize and explain that macromolecules such as lipids contain high energy bonds. We're going to talk about how those bonds are formed and how they're broken. And then explain the role of enzymes. That will be the very last set of notes. All right, this is just a reminder. You guys don't need to write this down, but remember kind of the big theme in all of our units in biology is homeostasis. How do living things maintain homeostasis? Remember what it is, and remember that all living things have we have a homeostatic mechanisms that help us get ourselves, if you remember, we kind of talked about back to middle or back to our center. So our normal temperature, 98.6 degrees, we have different homeostatic mechanisms that help us to maintain that. If we get too cold, we shiver to increase our temperature. If we get too warm, we sweat. So in this unit, we are going to talk about at the molecular level, what does our body do to help us to maintain homeostasis? So that one's just a reminder. Remember what homeostasis is. All right, why do we study chemistry and biology? Everything in life depends on chemistry. Taking in food, metabolizing it, breathing in oxygen, they're all part of a huge amount of chemical reactions that take materials in and make them useful for us. Living things are made from chemical compounds, and chemical energy is found in the bonds of living and non-living things. So we find chemical bonds both in ourselves and also in some of the things that we consume, maybe some of the vitamins, fats, carbs, lipids, nucleic acids, all those different things, proteins, all those different things we're going to talk about in this unit. Okay, now this is the first set of notes right here. This is where you should really start writing. Unit 2, Part 1, Chemistry Review. We have to make sure that we remember chemistry and the basics of the structure of the atom, a molecule, a compound, before we can start talking about these huge macromolecules in this unit. All right, so make sure you title these notes Unit 2, Part 1, Chem Review. Okay, key vocabulary that you are going to see in this part of the unit. Words that you saw last year in Chemistry 1 or Physical Science. You probably saw them maybe in middle school, maybe a little bit in elementary school. We're going to be talking about elements, isotopes, compounds, proton, neutron, electron, nucleus, ionic and covalent bonds, reactants, and products. Now, you guys don't need to write down all this key vocabulary. You're going to be writing it here in just a second in your notes. But just to key you into some of the words you're going to be seeing so you can start to think about what do I already know about this part of the unit. So let's start with smaller than the atom, subatomic particles. Remember, sub means below, so below an atom or smaller than an atom, subatomic particles. You guys know a proton is positively charged. It is located in the nucleus. Neutrons are neutrally charged, which means they have no charge, and those are also located in the nucleus. Your proton and neutron put together contain the majority of the mass of your atom. Electron is a negatively charged particle orbiting around the nucleus in the electron cloud. The electrons are the things that are exchanged or shared in our bonds. Nucleus contains your protons and neutrons, and atoms that are balanced have a neutral charge because they have the same number of protons and electrons, so they balance out and they have zero charge. Little fun fact for you, you don't have to write this one down. Approximately 100 million atoms equal the width of your little finger. So remember, we're looking at the atomic scale, not something that we can see with microscopes. Even electron microscopes, even the greatest, fanciest microscopes that we talked about in Unit 1 are not going to be able to really see the structure of an atom. An element. An element is a pure substance which is all one type of atom. So oxygen is an element. Gold is an element. If you tell me that you have, 3 grams of gold, that's an element. It's a pure element. It's all one type of atom. Now you can have more than one atom combined. You can have a molecule that's still an element. For example, you could have O2, that's 2 oxygens, still an element. An isotope is an element with a different number of neutrons. I call them fat atoms. So right here, you guys can see hydrogen. You guys know that hydrogen is number 1 on the periodic table. Number 1. Who's number 1? Hydrogen's number 1. It has 1 proton and 1 electron. So we know that this is a atom of hydrogen. Now this also has 1 proton and 1 electron. Still hydrogen. 1 proton, 1 electron, still hydrogen. The thing that sets them apart is they have different numbers of neutrons. So they are all still hydrogen, but these two are hydrogen with a different mass. You just need to know that isotopes are same atom, different mass, or same element, different mass. If you guys remember the example I gave you in class, I said if Miss Cozen gains 10 pounds, she's still Mrs. Cozen. Same concept of an isotope. All right, a compound is a chemical combination of 2 or more elements in definite proportions. Examples would be water, which is H2O, so 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. NaCl, table salt, sodium and chlorine. Okay, this is a compound. A compound is always 2 or more elements. So something like O2 would not be a compound. That's an element. It's all the same kind of thing. Okay. Now bonds. You might remember these as well. Ionic and then covalent is the next one we'll talk about. In an ionic bond, electrons are transferred, usually from metals to nonmetals. The electrons are not shared, they're transferred, and then one becomes negatively charged and the other ion becomes positively charged. A little comic here to help you remember it. This guy says, I'm hit, I've lost an electron. He says, are you sure? I'm positive. Because the ion that loses the electron becomes positive. Ha ha, ha ha, nice joke, Cozen. So that's your ionic bonds. Now covalent bonds, these are our really strong bonds that we're going to be talking about a lot in this unit. A bond that shares electrons to meet the octet rule. If you don't remember what the octet rule is, that is the rule that all atoms want to have their outer layer full. And for the most part, that outer layer needs 8 electrons. So let's say carbon only has 4 electrons. It needs to share 4 electrons with other atoms in order to feel full. Okay, so that's the octet rule. Usually it's 2 nonmetals, so like on the right side of the periodic table, which is great. Those nonmetals are the things that we use in a lot of our covalent compounds in macromolecules. So living things like nonmetals. We really like nonmetals for most of our macromolecules. Okay, a little practice in case you want to see, are they ionic or covalent? Ionic, you've got a metal and a nonmetal. Covalent, 2 nonmetals. Ionic, metal, nonmetal. Covalent, nonmetal, nonmetal. Okay, ionic, metal, nonmetal. Okay, covalent, nonmetal, nonmetal. You can see things like CO2, carbon dioxide that we breathe out. That is, it's a covalent compound and it's a compound that living things utilize. All right, chemical reactions. This is a really good example for you to write down. Chemical reactions consist of 2 parts. Reactants, which are the materials we start with. Those are your raw ingredients. Then the arrow represents some type of chemical reaction, not just mixing together, but an actual chemical change. And on the other side, out comes a product or materials that are produced by the chemical reaction. Do you guys remember what type of chemical reaction this is? See if you can remember. You've got decomposition, single replacement, double replacement, or synthesis. And this one is a synthesis reaction because we have 2 reactants synthesizing and becoming 1 new product. You don't need to know that, but just in case you maybe were thinking of that as you went through these notes. All right, now let's talk about bonds in water and properties of water that help living things. Starting with acids and bases. Okay, acids and bases on a pH scale. Okay, so your pH scale looks like this. Down here, you've got like maybe a 0 right there. In the middle, you got a 7. Woo! On the end, you got a 14. All right. So we have acids down here from 0 to 7, bases from 7 to 14. And right in the middle here, this is where living things like to be. This is neutral. Now, why do living things want to stay neutral? That's because neutral is not corrosive. The further you go into the acid part of the scale and the further you go into the basic part of the scale, the more corrosive solution becomes. And corrosive means it burns. Okay, so living things don't want solutions in them that burn. So most of our solutions, like blood, urine, milk, tap water, the things that we use are usually really, really, really close to 7. You start to get down in the acid range, you start to see orange juice, pop, vinegar, lemon juice, and then way down here on this end you might see like battery acid. In the basic range, you could see like sometimes blood is a little bit basic, sometimes tap water is a little bit basic, and when you get way down to this end you get things like bleach and ammonia. Now in our bodies we have buffers, and buffers help us to prevent sudden pH changes. For example, you have a buffer in your stomach, and that buffer helps to keep the pH from the acid in your stomach from burning through the lining of your stomach actually. So you have acid inside your stomach, and then you have a lining that's very basic. It's a buffer that kind of neutralizes that acid. All right, polar bonds. Polar bonds are just exactly what you think they are. They are opposite bonds. Just like there are 2 poles on a magnet, and there is a north and south pole on our planet, polar bonds have an uneven distribution of electrons. So they have a positive end and a negative end. So that means that if a molecule has a positive end, that positive is going to be attracted to a negative. My little comic here is trying to show how polar ions might be attracted to each other. You can see the positives going after the negatives there. Now, polar bond is a really general term, and the example underneath that is called a hydrogen bond and applies specifically to water. So that's next. Okay, hydrogen bond, the bond between positive hydrogen and negative oxygen. So this is a polar bond. It's an example of a polar bond. So here's your water molecule, lovely. You have a negative up here. That means that the majority of the electrons have sort of migrated to this side of the molecule. So this side's negatively charged, which leaves this side positively charged. Now positive and negative are attracted to each other. So as this water molecule comes in contact with another one, it's going to form a hydrogen bond, or the water itself is going to be attracted to another water. It's how water holds itself together. If you've ever seen water when it's spilled on a tabletop or on the floor and it kind of all pools up in one little sort of looks like a bubble with no air in it, that's an example of hydrogen bonds. You need to know that nonpolar substances only dissolve in other nonpolar substances, and polar dissolve in each other. So if I put oil and water together, oil floats on top of water because oil is nonpolar and water is polar. And that is the end of part 1 chemistry review.